So we kind of kicked off last week with a conversation, this new series, and what this series that we're starting really today is about is thinking a little bit about some of our beliefs, but not, often as Christians when we think about our beliefs, we're thinking like, well, I want to make sure I believe the right thing. I've got to get all these beliefs just right. But really what we're going to try to do over the next few weeks is talk about what we believe, but with an eye toward what Jesus describes as a transforming journey. What we believe, how does it hinder us? How does it help us? Where does it take us in reality? Jesus said, I came that you might have life and have it to the full. So that's beyond just beliefs, right? That's something to be received, to be embraced, to be discovered, to be lived. And Jesus says, this is what I came to bring you. So it can't just stop with, So I guess I'm saying all that to say, the next few weeks is not going to be about just like straightening out our beliefs. It's going to be about asking about where they take us. When we listen to Jesus and the apostles, we hear that if the Son sets you free, you will be free indeed. We hear that we are blind, but our blindness will be healed. We hear that we have been lost, but now we are going to be found, and we hear that everything is going to be made new. So that sounds a lot to me, like a lot more to me than just believing the right religious ideas. Now, part of the point of this series is to wonder about some of our beliefs, the way we think about certain things, and ask if those things help us with that seeing and healing and freedom. And one thing we Christians have focused on a lot is our ideas about sin. And so I want to think with you about that this morning. And I know that you all woke up this morning and you just said to yourself, as soon as your eyes opened, man, I just hope Pastor Fran talks about sin a lot at church today. But if we're going to talk about a journey of being, of becoming, we have to talk about this, because one of my biggest epiphanies in recent years is that the way we think about sin, the way we're taught about sin, has, and I know this sounds bold, has derailed our journey toward wholeness more than it has helped it. We thought by telling everyone how terrible they were, we were going to get them where God wanted to take them, but I don't think it worked. Now, of course, growing up, you're not really thinking about these things, even if you grew up in church, but you are being taught about these things. So maybe if you grew up Catholic, maybe it was about going to confession. I've sinned, I've done bad things, I need to go to confession and get forgiven. Or maybe you sat in some other kind of church with a fiery preacher and he talked about sin and how terrible sin was and maybe how terrible you were as a sinner. And those things, they kind of, either way, they kind of sink into us. And you probably, if you grew up in church, understood sin as meaning two things. One is that you were bad, and the second one was that you needed God to forgive you. And a lot of us have been taught this idea of original sin. You've probably heard that phrase. It's the idea that when Adam and Eve sinned, they became sinful in their very nature, and then they passed on, almost genetically as it were, that sinful nature to every child born into the human race, which left us with, and I drank that in for years, and yet there was always this little thing in the back of my mind that found it a little odd, because it kind of left us with this odd theology where we thought, man, if only that thing with the apple hadn't happened, right? Like if only that thing with the apple hadn't happened, everything would have been okay. Like you think about all the people who've lived across human history and two people screwed the thing up for all of us. Now, obviously, all human beings sin. We all fall short. We've all done things that were wrong. But, and I don't know if you know this, it was St. Augustine in the 4th century who really first taught this idea of original sin. And then John Calvin, the reformer, picked it up 1,000 years later, and he took it even further, so that what we got in most Protestantism was this idea that what defines you, the truest thing about your nature as a human being, is how bad you are. That's the deepest thing about us. And when you joined Augustine's idea of you being bad to the bone, with St. Anselm's economic picture in the 11th century of the gospel being about a debt that you owe God that you can't pay, and then with John Calvin and Martin Luther's fresh discovery of God's forgiving grace, which was a good discovery, what almost the entire church fell into by the 1600s was the idea, now listen to this, that the real problem with sin was that you were living in an unforgiven state and therefore wouldn't get into heaven when you die. Just let that sink in for a minute. Augustine to Anselm to Calvin and Luther. Now, this is the point in my sermon where someone vigilant will think, oh, I know what he's doing. This is one of those soft on sin sermons where he's just going to say we all need to feel better about ourselves. But that's not what I said. What I'm raising is this question. What is the problem with sin? What's the problem? We know sin's a problem. What is the problem with sin? And what we've been taught is that A, the primary problem is that we've offended God's holiness. B, because God is so holy, the dark cloud then in all of this is your guilt. You're guilty. That's the thing that defines you. And then C, because we are guilty, a holy God can't accept us and certainly can't let us into heaven. I was even taught when I first started going to kind of what I call Bible preaching type churches. I guess this is a Bible preaching type church, but we're different. I was taught that God is so holy that he can't let sin into his presence. Some of you have heard that in church. Which I now think is so interesting because we say that Jesus is God incarnate, and yet exactly the thing Jesus got in trouble for was letting sin into his presence. That's what he got in trouble for with the religious people, right? Because he ate with sinners, and he let sinners touch him, and he touched them. So, if God is so holy that he can't let sin near his presence, how in the world is it that God incarnate goes straight to the people whose sin is so obvious and he hangs out with them? We should ask ourselves this question. How does Jesus talk about sin? If Jesus talked about sin and what the real problem is with sin, the way that we have, the way that we do, then what we would expect to find in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John is Jesus walking around saying things like this. Listen. This is Jesus. Listen, here's the deal. You're a sinner, and because you're bad, you're so sinful, my Father can't be around you and he can't let you into heaven. But don't worry, because later on, I'm going to die for you, and then if you just accept me, God will finally forgive you and your sin won't keep you out of heaven. Here's the problem. We never hear Jesus say anything like this. That's kind of weird. Because I sat in churches where that was preached to me for 20 years. And we never hear Jesus talk like this. Now don't mishear me. I believe in sin. I think I believe in sin more than the people who really think they believe in sin. Because I've thought more deeply about what it actually is. But don't mishear me. I believe in sin and I believe in forgiveness and I believe in what Jesus did in his death and resurrection. But that doesn't change the fact that Jesus doesn't seem to think about the problem of human sin the same way we've been taught about it. What does Jesus think? Jesus thinks the problem with our sin is that we're flying blind and we're hurting other people when we crash into them. Let me read you something Jesus said from Matthew chapter 7. Therefore, whatever you want people to do to you, however you want to be treated, do those things also for them. For this sums up the entire law and the prophets. So what's Jesus say? Jesus is saying, well, the problem is what y'all are doing to each other. So one way to reverse that would be for you to treat other people the way you actually say you would like to be treated. Because, see, Jesus is identifying the problem. The problem is, I hurt you, you hurt me, and then I hurt you back. And then we just go around and around and around. And then he says this, which this was pointed out to me. Every now and then someone points something out to me in the Bible, and I'm embarrassed that I didn't see it after 40-some years of reading the Bible. But somebody pointed this out to me a few years ago, and it was just one of those moments for me. So these are right next to each other in the Sermon on the Mount. Whatever you want people to do for you, you do that for them. This is the whole law and the prophets. Then here are the next words. Enter by the narrow gate, for wide is the gate and broad is the way that leads to destruction, and there are many who go in by it, because narrow is the gate and difficult is the way which leads to life, and there are a few who find it. How interesting that those are side by side, one after the other. Jesus says, here's the problem. It's how you're treating each other, so treat other people the way you want to be treated. Enter by this narrow gate. We've defined the narrow gate as all these things. You better pray the right words and the right prayer to accept Jesus as your Savior. That's the narrow gate. You better live a holy enough life and be a good enough Christian. That's the narrow gate. You know what Jesus says the narrow gate is? The narrow gate is you getting your head around things right so that you actually can treat other people the way you would like to be treated. And he says that other road, that's the one that leads to destruction. What he means is to you all destroying each other. Right? We framed this in this whole different thing about making it a test about who gets in and who doesn't. And Jesus is saying, no, there's a better road, but most people aren't finding it. So Jesus thinks the problem with our sin is that we're flying blind, we're hurting other people when we're crashing into them. Now, if we were to excavate a little deeper under these things, us thinking that it's these things being us thinking that it's mostly about our guilt and our unacceptability, how bad we are, and Jesus saying, no, the problem is that you're not really seeing right, and because of that, you're hurting each other. If we were to dig deeper under what we've already kind of said here, I think we would find another thing that we need a massive shift with, and that's this, that when we frame our whole problem in terms of holiness, badness, guilt, and forgiveness, the paradigms for how we think about God that fit with that are paradigms like master and servant, judge and defendant, right? Because the way we've talked about sin as Christians and in the church is framed in these terms of God's holiness, our badness, our guilt, and our need to be forgiven. Now, I'm not saying those things aren't true. I'm just saying that's the whole paradigm that we've kind of been handed, and from a particular slant. And the paradigms for thinking about God that fit with that way of thinking are paradigms like master and servant, judge and defendant. And I wouldn't throw out God as master. I believe God is master of all things, and I wouldn't throw out God as judge. God is judge. Paul says, what father doesn't discipline the children he loves? There's a judgment in there. I wouldn't throw out the image of God. There's truth there. But I wonder if we have noticed in the Gospels that one of the huge things Jesus does is introduce a new paradigm for how we think about God. And maybe it's just because it's in the Bible and we kind of have received the Bible in our time as a whole package. Maybe because we've received the Bible that way. Maybe we just say, well, we hear Jesus talk about these things and we say, well, that's just normal, Jesus. That's just always the way it's been. But I assure you that for the people in Jesus' day, this new paradigm was radical. And Jesus gives it to us in a story. A certain man had 2 sons, and the younger of them said to his father, Father, give me the portion of goods that is mine to have. And so the father divided up his estate. And not many days after, the younger son gathered everything together, and he journeyed off to a far country, and there he wasted his possessions with wild living. But when he had spent everything, there arose a severe famine in that land, and he began to be in want. And then he went and joined himself to a citizen of that country, and that citizen sent him into his fields to feed the pigs. And he would gladly have filled his stomach with the pods that the pigs ate, but no one gave him anything. But then he came to himself. And he said, how many of my father's hired servants have bread enough to spare? And here I am perishing in hunger. I will arise and go to my father, and I will say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you, and I am no longer worthy to be called your son, so make me like one of your hired servants. And so he left that place, and he went home to his father. But when he was still a long way off, his father saw him and had compassion on him and ran to him and fell on his neck and covered him with kisses. And the son said to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and in your sight, and I am no longer worthy to be called your son. But the father said to his servants, Bring out the best robe and put it on him, and put a ring on his hand and sandals on his feet, and bring the fatted calf here and kill it, and let us eat and be merry. For this is my son who was dead and is alive again. He was lost and he is found. And they began to be merry. Now the older son was in the field, and as he came and drew near to the house, he heard music and dancing. So he called to one of the servants, and he asked what was going on. And the servant said to him, Your brother has come home, and because your father has received him safe, he has killed the fatted calf. The older son was angry and would not go in. Therefore the father came out, and he pleaded with him. And so he answered his father, and he said, Listen, all these years I have been serving you, and I have never broken your commandments at any time, and yet you have never given me a young goat, that I might make merry with my friends. But as soon as this son of yours, you catch that? Not my brother. As soon as this son of yours comes home, who has devoured your estate with harlots, you killed the fatted calf for him. And the father said to him, Son, you are always with me, and everything I have is yours. It was right that we should make merry and be glad, for your brother was dead and is alive again, and was lost and is found. Now, did you notice that the son, when he is coming home, how he is completely steeped in a paradigm in terms of how he thinks about his relationship with his father? He's completely steeped in a master and servant or judge and guilty accused kind of paradigm. That's why all the way home he practices what? His confession. I got to say just the right thing. I got to confess in just the right way, and then maybe maybe I can be forgiven. Maybe I can have some scraps. Maybe I'll get a spot in the barn to sleep. And did you notice that when he goes to recite his confession asking for forgiveness, his dad appears to not even be listening to him? Just appears to not even be listening to him. He's like, Father, he's down on his knees. He's probably got his face in the dirt. I've sinned against you and against heaven, and I know you don't want me back. I know you don't love me, but maybe I could be like a hired hand. Just maybe. And his dad is already yelling to the other servants, saying, Get the robe. Put a ring on his finger. The ring was what you paid for things with. It was the Visa card. Get this boy a Visa card back in his pocket, right? Put sandals. His shoes are worn. Put some sandals on his feet for goodness sake. The son is like, I'm really bad. And the father is like kissing him and hugging him. And you're like, what is going on here? The father is warm. He's affectionate. He is forgiving. He is relational. So at the first moment he encounters his wayward son, he's completely relational, completely accepting, and insistent that his son immediately understand who he always was in the family and be restored to that place. Now I want you to stop and think about something. This isn't just another story Jesus tells. There's a reason this is the most known parable that Jesus tells in all of human history. And the reason is because this is Jesus' quintessential story about what God is like and how he sees us. This is the story for Jesus. This is the story that says, this is what God is like, and this is how he sees you. And it's very different from what our religion has taught us. Our religion has to, if we were to be based on how the modern church, the church, at least since the Reformation, has talked about sin and taught us about how we should see ourselves, we would be on our knees with our face in the dust, hoping to get back in, hoping to slip through those gates of heaven, maybe through the fires, hoping to get back in, hoping that maybe we could sleep in the barn instead of in hell. That's what we'd be hoping for. Is Jesus misleading us with this story? Because Jesus, religion in Jesus' day thought a lot about God, the really religious people, a lot like we've been taught, which is kind of ironic because we have the whole Jesus thing, but we still pretty much think like they did. And Jesus shows up and says, no, that's actually not what God is like. Is Jesus misleading us about what God is like? I don't think so. I think he's taking us into the bigger and better story. Okay. There's a third thing I hope I can help you all see this morning. And here it is. What have we talked about? We've talked about that the way we've thought and taught and been taught and talked about sin kind of has left us defining ourselves as primarily as bad, and God can't come near us and can't have anything to do with us. And then we've talked about the fact that when we think that way, God remains in our mind in this paradigm of master and servant, or judge and defendant, judge and accused. Here's this third, but Jesus talks about it differently, right? Jesus says, God is a good parent. He's crazy about you. He'd never give up on you. And yes, here's the thing about forgiveness. Like we've talked, and I don't mean to, I'm sure somebody will think I'm off with this. But, in my whole adult life in the church, it's been like forgiveness. Forgiveness is the easy part for God. Like that's not even a thing. I mean, you saw it in the story, right? Like, the son doesn't have to say, will you forgive me? And the father goes, well, I don't know. I'm thinking about it. Jesus is going to die for you later, so maybe I can, right? There's none of that. It's just like, it's a given. That's the phrase we would use. It's a given. Of course I forgive you. You're my child, right? So here's this third thing. When we focus mostly on the guilt, we will always think about sin in terms of a set of rules and infractions against those rules, right? So that's how we talk about it in churches. Every church has its own unique little list of like what's sinful and what's not, and are you a good enough Christian? Are you avoiding sin well enough? It's kind of a mechanical kind of approach to these things. And yes, at a basic level, there's truth in it. Do not murder. Do not steal. I'm all for those rules. And I'm all for avoiding any infractions against them. So we as Christians, we talk a lot about, well, this is sin and that is sin, and gee, I don't know, is this one really a sin? But Jesus talks about seeing more than he talks about sin. Matthew 13, after he tells all these parables about seeing the kingdom, he says, and seeing they do not see, and hearing they do not hear, and they do not really understand. And Paul, in his letters, talks about seeing, like in Ephesians. Paul doesn't say, I just pray you'll obey. He does at the end of his letters, which is funny. I don't know if you ever noticed this, but Paul's letters are really deep about transformation. And then at the end of all his letters, he basically says something like this. So, if you didn't quite get a hold of that, like get a job, quit cheating on your wife, like he always has like a little list at the end, right? Because he knows that depending on our stage, maybe that's what we need. But think like in Ephesians where Paul says, I pray that the eyes of your heart may be enlightened. So when we train people, or we train each other, or pastors like me train you, just to think about the Christian journey as, I got to be good, and I got to not sin, I got to avoid these sins. That's not really the deepest thing you need. The deepest thing you need is to see in a new way. So here it is. Thinking about sin primarily in a keeping the rules, guilt for breaking the rules kind of paradigm will never open the eyes of your heart or bring you healing or make you free. It's more than keeping the rules. And it's more than, and God is not a God who's sitting up there saying, boy, I really hope you're going to keep the rules today. He's got way bigger dreams for you than that. Here's something Paul said that I wish I could get all of you to memorize. We aren't a real big, you better memorize a lot of Bible kind of church, but if I could get you to memorize a verse, this would be one. Are you ready for this? So these are the words of Paul, who at one time in his life had been a great champion of focusing on the rules, right? He was a Jew. They had this whole Old Testament law, 613 commands, and you better keep them all. And Paul was going around telling everybody, you better keep them all, you better keep them all, you better keep them all. Then after decades of this transforming, awakening, becoming journey with Christ, he writes these words in his Galatian letter. If a law, and we could say any law, or any set of rules, if any set of rules had been created that could, listen to this phrase, impart life, then everything would have been made right by the law. You just can't ever be made into a new human being by mustering all your willpower and trying to keep the set of rules that somebody gave you. Because to be a human being is to be alive in a way that's more significant than that. It's to see something bigger. It's to have a bigger vision of life, of what life is, of what you are, of what other people are. Please tell me that verse meant something to you. If a law, because this is what we do, right? Is we tell each other, here's what a good Christian looks like, you better not sin, and this person better stop because they're sinning. And then we go out these days, and we, as Christians, we all want to police the culture. We want to tell everybody out in the culture who hasn't even yet thought maybe about a relationship with Jesus, how they're sinning and how bad they are. Paul says, if a law had been created, if any kind of set of rules had been created that could actually do what people need, which is to have life, then it would have happened through the rules. But it hasn't happened through the rules. God is not trying to just forgive us. That's easy for him. And God is not trying to just get us to have an epiphany about how bad and guilty we are. God is trying to impart life to us. To use the New Testament imagery, God is trying to raise us back to life. From death to life in here. Telling people how bad they are, focusing on original sin, as the church has been heavily doing for at least the last 500 years, has not imparted life to people, for the most part. I find it fascinating that at the beginning of the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus speaks a word over the crowd. I don't know if you ever noticed this, about their original goodness. Right? We always want to start in Genesis 3 with original badness. The whole apple incident. That's where we want to start, right? And then everything went bad after that. But that's not where the Bible starts. The Bible starts in Genesis 1 and Genesis 2, where God creates everything, and he creates human beings. And after he creates each thing, he says, oh, and it was good, it was good, it was good. Then he creates human beings, and he says, and it was very good. And when Jesus steps up to give, as far as what's recorded, the most significant talk we have of Jesus that was preserved, the Sermon on the Mount, at the very beginning, he doesn't get up to the crowd and say, now, the first thing we got to get straight is that you all are bad. He could have. You all are sinners. And I'm here to show you there's a way to at least get a place in the barn, right? No. Jesus stands up and he speaks this word of original goodness over them. This is what he says to the crowd. You are the light of the world. I would say if I'd been in that crowd, I'd been like, are you talking to me? Jesus says, you are the light of the world. You are the salt of the earth. And when Jesus says, but if the salt loses its saltiness, here's what I think he's saying to us. But if you forget who and what you really are, which we have, then what do we do then? More shame before a God bent on punishing us hasn't really helped us. I want you to see that our ideas about sin stunted our ideas about God. We never moved to the God picture of the Father in the prodigal son. We never moved there. We kept the master and servant paradigm for God. We kept the judge and guilty defendant paradigm before God. We never moved to the paradigm of the Father who really didn't care that much about the confession. He just cared about restoring his son to the life that his son was made for. The real journey is about seeing, about awakening, about remembering the sons and daughters of God that we really, really are and that we were always meant to be. By the way, I don't know if you know this. If we read the prodigal son through the lenses we've been given, we would say it's the story of the bad son, right? But you know what the word prodigal really means? It means wasteful. He went out and he He wasted his life. He was just chasing the wrong things because he couldn't really see. He didn't really understand what life was about. He didn't really understand who he was, and he didn't understand what he already had, all the gifts of his Father that he already had. And so he wasted it. The word sin in the New Testament, it doesn't mean, hey, you're really bad. It means, literally in Greek, it means to miss the mark. It comes from archery. You shoot and you didn't hit the target, that's us every day. Shooting and not hitting the target, missing the mark. And Jesus came so that we could see what the mark is, so that we could see what life is and what we are. And we would find a way to be awakened. And we would find a way for our feet to find their way onto a journey of becoming. I think it's kind of like I don't think sin means that all that goodness in us, and this alone, I suppose, is theologically controversial. Seems to be my specialty these days. I don't think that sin means that all the goodness in us was lost. I think it means that it was buried under the rubble. And Jesus came to raise us up, to dig us out, to put us back together. Lord, we love you. So grateful that you are not merely judge and we merely defendants, or you merely master and us merely servants, but that you are Father and Mother and the great love of the universe, and we are your children, and you have said to us, never will I leave you, never will I forsake you. Amen.